Hi everyone. Today we're on a Wednesday meeting again, and today the topic is robber barons. The talk is based on a small interview that Ayn Rand did in 1966, talking about what her view on the concept was and what could be a better way to think about these kind of people. Now, robber barons is a concept that may not be that used in the non-American world, but at the same time, I think it will be interesting for all of us, uh, either if you're in the UK or other parts in Europe, or even in other parts in the world aside of the US, to know what Ayn Rand had to say on the issue. And maybe we will learn something that could be brought into the world of today. Today, as always, we're having James Valliant with us to give us his view on the issue. And I was wondering if you could start with us by giving your view on this small interview that Rand gave, and also your view on what robber barons mean in the world today, and maybe what is your view on them overall?
First, I would point out that unlike a lot of political commentators at the time, Ayn Rand actually had some background information. She actually studied it. When you look at her library that she left after she passed away, she had histories of American business. She had biographies of American businessmen and women. She was interested in the field, and she really had studied it in a detailed way. And the basic point that she's making is that to call an American industrialist a baron, much less a robber baron, is to completely destroy the distinction, obliterate the distinction that really matters here, ethically speaking, and in consequence, economically speaking, right? In the medieval times, there were actual land barons who held their land by primogeniture with special land privileges. They were literal barons, and say they were along the great rivers along which trade flowed on the continent of Europe, like the Rhine River. And so there'd be these castles from these German barons, and you couldn't do trade, from Bavaria to the, to the Atlantic Ocean without having these stops at the point of a sword. And you got to pay their ridiculous tax or whatever they demand in order to engage in the trade. So literally speaking, these were robbers who were barons, who had special state privileges over the area that they were taxing, in effect, without any moral or legitimate right. To compare them to industrialists in the free market or businessmen in a free market is absolutely obscene. It turns the distinction completely upside down and on its head. Capitalism, historically speaking, slowly began to emerge in the English-speaking world, just as a matter of historical perspective, when government-granted monopolies were eliminated. If you didn't have a special license from the crown, if you weren't one of these licensed guilds in one of these cities, you were unable to compete, do business at all. Capitalism emerged when those monopolies started breaking up. And in the 1600s, the 17th century in England, and even more so in the 18th century, those monopolies vanished, and mostly, and open competition occurred. That's what generated the free market. Independent people actually free to compete with people in a productive sense, as opposed to merely being parasites who stole the productive efforts of other people at the point of a gun. In America, you got rich mostly in a free market, but exclusively in qua free market, only insofar as you were providing goods that people voluntarily wanted to buy, that they saw in their self-interest as a win-win exchange, not a point of the sword or point of the gun exchange, which is what the medieval robber barons were engaged in. The normal way the American West was developed was through what was known as the Homestead Act. And basically, the American West was empty, unpopulated, unused at the time. And if you were a rancher, a farmer, a miner, a businessman who wanted to set up a business in the West, what you did is you went out to what was unused, unclaimed land. You started, in the Lockean sense, mixing your labor with the soil, farming it, fencing it, developing it. And you would then file a claim. And it would be your land because you were the one out there developing it. With the railroads, for example, and this is the example Ayn Rand uses, the development of the Transcontinental Railroads in the United States. The first Transcontinental Railroad was developed with government subsidies by, quote, businessmen who were largely well politically connected. And the first Transcontinental Railroad was in effect subsidized by special land grants. So much land was granted on either side of the railroad to the railroad itself, as opposed to the people who were developing the land. This is a direct government subsidy. There were all kinds of other special government favors, easements, licenses, et cetera, that excluded other people from having that. So the first Transcontinental Railroad, built from San Francisco all the way to St. Louis, Missouri, right? We had one company that was building with government subsidies and favors, west from Missouri, another company from California, from Sacramento, going over the Sierra Nevada, and which was actually the much tougher technological challenge. And they met in Promontory, Utah, famously drove through the Golden Spike in a big political thing. Now, the railroad did not run successfully. In fact, most of these railroads that ever had government subsidies and grants had to file bankruptcy. Over the late 19th century was a plethora of railroads going bankrupt, right? Those companies that relied mostly on such government subsidies were boondoggles that came at the public's expense. So they're, in that sense, those guys make at least an analogous comparison to the robber barons. But Ayn Rand contrasts those guys, say the big four who built the Union Pacific Railroad. Those guys are in no way comparable to someone like James J. Hill. He was the guy who built the Great Northern Railroad only a couple decades later, and he did it practically with zero government subsidies. There have been those who have, since Ayn Rand pointed out, no, even James J. Hill got, a couple of favors here and there, especially local ones, but they were in the other analyses have now shown that they were insignificant to the man's success. What James J. Hill did was almost entirely without any government subsidies, any government favors, whatever. He went out, he personally surveyed the territory to know. He brought in immigrants, he brought in businesses. Many of the industries, many of the areas of agriculture, types of agriculture that the Pacific Northwest is now famous for, were actually developed by this guy, James Jerome Hill, who was bringing in industries, helping industries, private industries come in with, again, without any government help, that economically actually did develop the land. And by the way, he turned out to be a classic example of how to succeed, how to reinvest in your corporation, plow those profits back into your corporation, make money for your investors and yourself, right? And he ran really the first successful, sustainable transcontinental railroad, and demonstrating, one, that transcontinental railroads did not need government subsidies in the first place. Two, when government subsidies are granted and special favors are granted to these railroads, it is a corruption and inefficient, necessarily going to be a disaster compared to a more free market approach like was open to James J. Hill. We neither needed the government subsidies to create these railroads, and when we did, it resulted necessarily in corruption. And when I mean corruption, I mean corruption. The founders of this first transcontinental railroad that built it on government subsidies were politicians. The first head of this Western Railroad was a guy named Leland Stanford. He was one of the very first governors of California, back when the first Republican governor of California, back when California governors only had 2 years in office for a term. So being the 8th, he was actually only a brief time into the existence. He was one of the very first governors of the state. He was also one of the earliest senators from the state. In the 1860s, he was a governor of California. In the 1880s, he was a senator from California. He was a politician, and he used political favors, in effect, to get and maintain his position. What can you say? It directly for example, many of the greatest evils in the history of the American West could stem exactly from this moment of corruption. Take, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the only act in American history that specifically excluded one ethnic group from entering the country as immigrants. And it was focused on the Chinese. Now, obviously, with the gold rush in California in 1849, immigrants were coming from all over the world. They were coming from China, Europe, everywhere, because one of the largest gold finds ever in history was discovered in California. So people rushed. Mostly the gold miners did not make money, with a few exceptions. It was those who provided services, sold the stuff to the gold miners that made money. And that's how a guy like Leland Stanford first made his money, selling stuff to the gold miners, right? Well, his company brought in on purpose Chinese immigrants to work, and under brutal conditions, mind you. For a bowl of rice a day, they were going to plant dynamite, 1,000 feet up a steep hill to knock a portion open for the railroad to go through. Thousands and thousands of Chinese workers were killed, abused. And then on top of it, the insult to injury, the very railroad that had brought in Chinese immigrants to work on the railroad then feverishly advocated discriminatory laws against the Chinese in California. Now, some of these laws were declared unconstitutional. Some of them were maintained. It climaxed in the Chinese Exclusion Act. And men like Leland Stanford, way back when he was governor of California in 1862, was advocating for that, saying things like, we can't have inferior races, literally, an inferior and degraded race, that's literally how he spoke of them, entering our country. Wow. It was later revealed that his railroad, of course, had brought in thousands of Chinese immigrants to do the cheap, dangerous labor that he needed. But that didn't stop him. That didn't stop him from turning against the very people who had built his railroad with more government action to appease it was actually, of course, labor leaders who were behind the Chinese Exclusion Act. But there was a corrupt, in effect, alliance between these robber barons who did have a lot of economic control over the trade that was coming into California, right? That's why the comparison is made between, say, the barons on the Rhine River and the first Transcontinental Railroad that connected California to the east. But these guys were behind so much of the corruption and so much of the worst activity in American history, in my view, in the 19th century, which was mostly characterized by free market activities, men like James Jerome Hill. To compare him to a robber baron is obscene. It's to destroy the very distinction between a thief or a baron and a productive person who's making his money purely by voluntary trade because he's productive and he's producing something that people want. That's just the very opposite. On the one hand, you've got someone who's doing nothing but voluntarily trading to get his money, providing people with a value to get his money in a win-win situation for everybody, versus somebody who's getting special privileges, in effect, at the point of the gun from the government.
Thank you. What do you think about this proposal of some people of making a distinction between robber barons and captains of industry? Like, there's been a proposal for people like Vanderbilt to be called captain of industry and people like the Big Four to be called robber baron. Do you think that that's a good conceptualization? I mean, a good word, captains of industry?
Captain of industry is kind of a compliment, isn't it? Right? You're saying he's merely a leader. Captain might also, because it's a military kind of title, it almost implies, that kind of authority as well. A captain of industry can still be displaced. He's got to constantly be efficient and providing goods that people want and so forth. Even a captain of a ship has more authority than any real industrialist in the free market, no matter how rich he gets. John D. Rockefeller became the first, real super wealthy guy in the world, and he did this by providing cheap oil to as many people as he possibly could. And it was the very means by which he reduced the price of oil to his customers that was thought to be a monopolistic practice. So lowering prices for everybody, making petroleum products available more and more widely to everybody, was actually contributing to the development of technology, the economy. Think of all the ways in which cheap petroleum products have in fact generated our industrial world today in the last century and a half. We owe that, all of us owe that debt to John David Rockefeller. We cannot adequately, in fact, he may have gotten $1 billion in today's money from doing it, but that was inadequate compensation as far as I'm concerned, compared to the value he was actually providing the world. And he was considered a bad guy because he was taking over the petroleum business in America, basically taking over from all of the less efficient, more expensive competitors. To compare that guy simply because he basically gained control over a single market, but he only did it by reducing prices and increasing his customer base, is obscene. He's not a captain. He's not a baron. He's open to competition. Or Vanderbilt, there's another great example. When he went into the New York Railroad business, he basically did it as a free market entrepreneur. He made his money honestly. Yes, he consolidated the New York Central Railroads. That was a benefit to everybody in the Northeast. It dramatically helped the economic development of New York and the Midwest, right? To compare Vanderbilt or Rockefeller, who provided an incalculable value to his whole community, if you look at it from a collective standpoint, of course, he was just pursuing his own self-interest. There's no conflict between individual and collective interest here, right? It works because they were providing an actual value. To compare that to people who needed government favors, government subsidies to do their business is, again, to obliterate the very distinction, right, that makes the free market, that defines the free market. It is not a system of inherited privilege. America, when America got started in the very beginning, Thomas Jefferson eliminated things like primogeniture. You know, the land can go down to the eldest son and only to the eldest son, right? Nope. All in intestate succession, all the children, male, female, regardless of birth age, inherit from the parents. Eliminate titles of nobility, eliminate primogeniture, eliminate the exclusive rights to property that special families have, like noble families. That was done away with in America. Getting so that when, generally speaking, in the 19th century, when Americans made millions of dollars in today's money, they were doing so because they were providing all kinds of new products. Edison with his light bulb and electric generator, Bell with his telephone, the Wright brothers with their airplanes. What they're doing is they're innovating to make money. What they're doing is they're creating new products that are going to change the world. Okay, now those people are contributing things, as I say, it's how can we estimate the value, for example, of the telephone or the electric light bulb? It's hard to calculate. It really is. In effect, these guys only took a small, teeny portion of the value they provided humanity. And yet, the millions they made are considered obscene when they earned every penny and then some on purely voluntary trade, developing and contributing to the well-being of everybody else in the process. That's how I see it.
Don't you think that there's, I don't know how to put this question, but for instance, when I was taught history in universal history, it's always very political, like king this did that and had these political conflicts, and then this king died, and then this president came, and there were these revolutions, and this act came by. And it's very difficult to see something that it's not legally related or some revolution war related. And when one sees the US primarily, also a little bit of the UK, there's a lot of talking about industrialists, and I think it reflects that people think that there's something important there, but at the same time they don't know how to conceptualize it, and I'm not sure if, I mean, they don't know if they should say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, especially in the US. Do you think that that's an essential conflict in American?
You've really brought up a good point. It still exists today. The debate, in effect, is still active today, and it blurs political lines, right? Take, for example, the debate over big tech's control over the media and information flow right now. It is true that Google and Twitter and Facebook really control a massive market share there, right? To separate out the reasons for why they have that market share, whether it's purely a free market thing or based in some ways on government favors and help, is complex, right? The social media got special favors, exclusion from certain lawsuits, which helped them maintain a position separate from other media outlets. You know, a newspaper or television station could be sued for what they put on their platform, whereas Facebook and Twitter cannot be. Was that special favor instrumental in giving them their uniquely powerful position? If so, to that extent, they relied upon a special government favor and not open competition in the free market, right? That's why I myself am willing to relook at something like their civil liability protections. Again, it's like James J. Hill. I don't think they need that civil liability protection to exist. I think we can have, in effect, a transcontinental railroad without government subsidies or favors. If you really believe that, then get rid of the special favors. Once you've gotten rid of those special favors, then of course Twitter is a private company that can exclude whoever they want from their platform. And it can't be called censorship in any conceivable, even remote sense, right? And so what's really funny today is you'll have leftist politicians who've forgotten the concepts that they used to promote: anti-competitive practices, collusion between businesses, which is clearly what's going on right now from their old standpoint, or corporate censorship, the anti-concept that they used to advocate for so strongly. All of our leftist friends have suddenly forgotten about anti-competitive practices and corporate censorship. They're the ones saying, because of Twitter and Google are now left of center, that they can do whatever they want because they're private businesses. And of course, many of our friends on the right have completely forgotten their principles. They're now embracing ideas like corporate censorship and anti-competitive practices, monopoly laws, and so forth. And so, yeah, the very blurring of that distinction is the insidiously evil thing. That's why we need a separation of economics and state, just as Ayn Rand said, for the same basic reason that we need a separation of church and state. Really, it comes down to the same fundamental reason, right? The free operation of the human mind, right? That's what it's all about. And so the issue is an ongoing one, and the question in a mixed economy becomes, what is the fundamental here? The government favor that's allowing the company to succeed and maintain its position of dominance, or is it truly open and free competition by which it's maintaining its position? Yeah. And the more the economy gets mixed and blurred, the harder it is to make the distinction between someone like James J. Hill and Leland Stanford, basically a productive businessman who's doing everything voluntarily and contributing to the economic development of the region, as opposed to Leland Stanford, who's basically a politician, doing it on public favors and subsidies and on the public dime.
Is that Stanford the same of the school? The name?
I'm sorry?
The name of the school, Stanford University,
Yes.
that name?
Leland Stanford, as I say, was, and in fact, all of these guys, his partners called the Big Four, were major developers of the state of California, right? They took their money and maintained their position. They had fights with each other after a while. Stanford University was named after the son of Leland Stanford, who died as a young man. And the death of his son inspired Senator Stanford to found Stanford University. Yes. You may have heard of some of the other Big Four people like Collis Huntington. His nephew, Henry Huntington, is the founder of the Huntington Library, one of the most important, research archives in the world today. They were philanthropists, yes, but they were also rotten politicians who helped, encourage California to have racist laws against the Chinese, even though they themselves had brought in and badly exploited Chinese labor. Yes.
In the past, sorry, in one of the past answers that you gave, you mentioned like the hatred and resentment that many of these people pulled from some commentators. But at the same time, what I think it's really interesting is that it's not only because they were rich, but there's something more. Because the other day I was hearing about the richest person that ever lived, and it happens to have lived like in the 14th century. I'm going to butcher his name. I think it's Mansa Musa. I mean, the guy was so rich that he just poured money like crazy, and one day he went to Egypt and he gave so much gold that the value of gold just went away for decades in the place. And apparently, in history, he's not that hated.
Right, but he
These
literally
people
was
do.
an equivalent of a robber baron, right? Yeah, he controlled trade and became extremely rich due to a political position he had in controlling trade in North Africa, between, that area of the world. He really controlled that area of the world. And comparative wealth, gosh, in today's dollars, if you think about it, someone like Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt, the famous queen of Egypt, who really, soared the breadbasket for the Mediterranean world and eventually the whole Roman Empire. I mean, she was an extremely rich lady. Compared to everyone else at the time, she was one of the Roman emperors after her. These Roman emperors were richer than anyone in the world. Their private fortunes were vast. But these people were emperors and queens and kings, obtaining their money by means of that special power of force that they had to control trade. Cleopatra herself shut down any trade with someone she was not politically happy with, right? And she knew she controlled the grain supply of the Mediterranean. Made her very, very rich and made her influential in Roman politics. Now that's like a robber baron. Comparative wealth can be acquired at the point of a gun. In fact, in ancient times, there are very few people, very few people are very, very rich. Everyone else is in effect poor. That's what characterizes, that extreme contrast is what characterizes pre-capitalist economies. What characterizes a capitalist economy is an emerging and growing middle class. More and more and more and more people consider, I know this is a point that objectivists often make, and it's a great place to make this point. Today, the ordinary person in a capitalist country lives better than any pharaoh of Egypt, Roman emperor, or Louis XIV ever possibly could. Ever possibly could. The quality and variety and safety of our food, the quality and variety and power of the entertainment we have available. I use this example. You're a Roman emperor and you have insomnia, you get bored at night. So you say, I want some entertainment. Bring me a funny guy. He comes in. What choice do you have but the one or two funny guys that are available to you then, right? I can turn on my television at 2 a.m. and I have American cable television. It's ridiculous. Hundreds of television channels providing me anything. Oh, do I want to watch a comedy, a horror movie, a history documentary, an old classic movie from Hollywood? All these are news. All these are now options to me. Louis XIV had much inferior. He was the richest man in France, wasn't he? He had much inferior. He lived at poorer man than the ordinary American lives today, in terms of the clothes, the food, the available travel available to him, the quality of entertainment. Forget medicine. Forget a toothbrush and modern shampoo. No, the ordinary person in a capitalist society, the ordinary middle class person in a capitalist society lives better than any of these super rich people from the distant past, whatever their extreme wealth was. It's not, but that's not the essential. It's not the extreme contrast in wealth. If the wealth is made voluntarily on a free market, then it's earned and has to be maintained. It's not like you can have what maintains wealth, right? Protects it from any future competition is a government favor. And the history of so-called progressive legislation in my country, right? The design to protect the consumer or limit monopoly abuses, in nearly every case, they were the result of certain businessmen going to the government to get special favors to exclude competition. Progressivism wasn't some, swelling from the actual need. It was really the result of businessmen getting favors, from politicians that they were buying. And we call that today, quote, progressive legislation. Take the Pure Food and Drug Act that happened 100 years ago, right? What it in effect does is delay medicines from coming to the market in America, right? And it keeps the price of medicine high for those pharmaceutical companies that are engaged in it and can meet. Remember, every regulation tends towards monopoly abuse because it creates an obstacle, a barrier to entry, increases the cost of some competitor coming in. The more regulation we can stack on only provides the existing firms a unfair, by the point of a gun, competitive advantage over any potential newcomer. And they knew that. They weren't concerned about the pure food. They used the complaint about snake oil being sold as medicine to get the law. But
What's
in
the law?
effect, what
Sorry.
they wanted to do was control competition.
What does the law say? Sorry, I didn't.
The Pure Food and Drug Act requires that before, there were various stages of it, requires that before you can sell food or medicine, you have to meet government inspection standards, right? So snake oil, bad medicine. People would sell, cod liver oil and say it would cure cancer, right? I'm just picking a random example. So fraudulent medicines were big business, right? And in order to eliminate this fraudulent business, right, they said we need the Pure Food and Drug Act. Note, it didn't completely eliminate the sale of the equivalent of snake oil. We still have homeopathic nonsense. We still have all kinds of food and medicine nonsense, right? It didn't eliminate the problem, but it did make it harder for anyone to compete with pharmaceutical companies, didn't it? And that, in effect, is what the history of progressive legislation in my country really amounts to. Certain businessmen already established wanting to maintain their position and using government favors and laws to help them maintain that position. Every regulation contributes to monopoly abuse and gets us back a closer step back to the real robber barons.
Yes. Actually, that takes us to another point that I wanted to talk about, which is monopolies. But I would just like to say, people in Zoom, that feel free to raise up your hand in case that you have a question. I'll pull it through. And also, if you're on YouTube, you can go through Super Chat to ask any question that you want. So I'm going to try to be a little bit of devil's advocate and say that, well, free market has actually led to monopolies. And we need those kind of regulations to stop tycoons or any kind of business people to stop them and not to acquire the whole market share and exercise some monopolistic power. What would you say?
Well, I would say, what do you mean by monopoly? If you mean that there's only a single firm providing this specific product, well, then I don't see necessarily anything wrong with that, right? There's several ways to look at this. Every firm, whatever they produce, is actually in competition with every other firm, right? It's not just, say, leather belt manufacturers versus leather belt manufacturers. There's the leather purse market, the leather shoe market, the leather coat market, the leather and not just leather. He's competing with denim. He's competing with cotton. He's competing with plastic. Every firm, the wider you go out, is competing with every other firm, right? Because the complex decisions of each consumer in the particular configuration of products they buy is what we're competing for, right? So on a free market, the mere existence of a single, it's funny because on the left, they'll sometimes say having multiple firms competing for the same industry is inefficient. Well, sometimes that's true. Sometimes in the development of an industry, it really makes better sense to have one firm because, it's consolidating the market and reducing prices. But look, what's going on? It's reducing prices. It's making it more and more available to the consumer. So long as that's going on, what the heck is wrong with one firm having it? And that's generally the case. You'll notice in a free market, for example, let's take in the last 60 years, the price of consumer electronics, right? Computers, music devices, things like that. Down. The tendency in the free market is to reduce the price, right? Whether there's 6 firms competing or 1, right? Notice the areas where prices are constantly going up: education, healthcare, the areas where American government is most concerned about subsidizing and regulating. It's in those areas that the inflation is just absurd and seems to be never ending, precisely because those are so important. Government's got to subsidize those. And in effect, what that means is fewer and fewer people are actually have that available to them, less and less competition, and so forth. So what do you mean? Ayn Rand would draw the distinction between coercive monopoly and just the fact that you have a single company providing that good. And that's the key, again, the key distinction. The very distinctions, like robber baron blurs, are the key distinctions here. And of course, the left, progressives, our leftist friends, have a vested interest in blurring those distinctions, in making those distinctions sort of seem invisible and go away, right? So long as competition is open, so long as a competitor is free to enter the field, the mere fact that there's one provider of that is not itself a monopoly. In fact, he's got to avoid what we call monopolistic abusive practices in order to maintain his control of that market, right? Whereas a coercive monopoly doesn't need to satisfy consumers, remain efficient, cut costs, etc. All it needs is the government favor.
In your view, as I mean, you know a lot about legal procedures. In your view, do you think that business people with antitrust laws have less rights than, for instance, a criminal? I mean, less legal protection than criminals?
Yes. The Supreme Court in our country requires that when I was a prosecutor for many years, and when you charge someone, say, with murder, it requires specific standards, high standards, and a clear standard of objective evidence. Antitrust laws are a classic example of what Ayn Rand called a non-objective law. I mean, look at it. If you charge too much, well, you're proving you're a monopoly, whatever they think is too much. You're obviously proving that you're a monopoly, abusing your monopolistic privilege. If you charge too little, why, then you're undermining the competition. You're right. You're unfairly being too efficient. So unfair competition if you charge too little. You're obviously demonstrating you're a monopoly if you charge too much. Now, if you charge about the same, well, then that's prima facie evidence that you're colluding with your competitors against the consumer. So think of it. You're a businessman. What do? How do I avoid antitrust prosecution? Well, it's in effect impossible to truly judge, and it's a question of political favors. And that has exactly been the history of antitrust enforcement in my country. It's not as it's so funny. Within my lifetime, the government broke up the monopoly, the telephone monopoly, the national telephone monopoly of AT&T, which had in effect a government-granted monopoly to control telephone communications in this country. Long-distance telephone communications were all controlled by law and given to one company. The government created that decades ago, and then decades later, filed antitrust laws against the monopoly they created by law. Or, Microsoft several years ago became the big power in its industry, simply becoming the #1 power in its industry, put a target on its back, and Bill Gates had to bend over backwards to make sure he didn't end up in jail. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Yes, businessmen, in effect, are always subject to a non-objective law that they really can't predict how it will be enforced against them. Much worse, in effect, than what the ordinary person charged with a murder has. A clear objective standard of what to do, what he did wrong, of one that applies to everybody, right? With the same standards of evidence for everybody.
What about the separation of powers? I don't know how it works in the US, but the few antitrust cases that I've seen in other countries, they're like institution one, and antitrust institution one sets the laws, sets the executive orders, like administers the law, and also the judicial processes. I mean, it's not only with antitrust cases. There are also many other regulatory issues and agencies that set the same laws. But do you think that that's also another case where people have less rights? Because, for instance, if I stole an apple and somebody came to me and a policeman came to me, that policeman would have to go through a whole judicial case where there's a separation of cases, and different agencies have to make the case. But in this case, it's like, just go to the next counter.
One of the genius things behind really the founding of my country was this concept, putting into practice this concept of separation of powers. You know, the British Parliament really, in effect, has all the power, right? The majority who controls the House of Commons controls the executive branch, names the ministers, sets the actual policy for the country. So there's really no distinction between legislative and executive authority there. This is also true of the judicial. Until Great Britain developed a Supreme Court, the House of Lords was the highest court in the land, right? There was really no separation of judicial, executive, and legislative functions in Great Britain. Under the influence of certain political thinkers like Montesquieu, the framers of my country said, no, 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 no. It doesn't work that, it shouldn't work that way. The people who make the laws should never have, for example, they took away from Congress any ability to pass a bill of attainder. You know, Parliament could pass a bill that said, Joe, you're a rotten guy. What? Without any trial? Yep, and we're going to take away Joe's property and we're going to put Joe in prison by an act of Parliament, an act of attainder. Such acts were made unconstitutional in America. Congress can only make laws. It cannot enforce the laws. It cannot interpret the laws it makes. It simply defines the rule. The executive has the exclusive power to enforce the law. He doesn't make the law. He enforces the law that's already been made. And the Supreme Court stands over both of them to say, hey, are you guys complying with the Constitution in doing your separate functions? Making law, enforcing law. This has a great effect on fairness, due process, and the equality of enforcement of law in America. It also keeps the different branches of government sort of in competition with each other, right? With the 20th century and the advent of economic regulations, that idea has been stomped on in my country. Let's go back to the example of the Food and Drug Administration that was created by the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is more than 100 years old now. It created an agency that makes the rules, enforces the rules, adjudicates every violation of the rules. They make the rule and they will interpret how the rule is enforced, and they will enforce it against specific, well, in the middle of the 20th century, many legal thinkers said, hey, doesn't that violate the US Constitution? You know, James Madison's idea of separation of powers, they're all being shoved into these regulatory agencies. The Supreme Court, under the influence of progressive justices, said, no, 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 that's okay. Congress can give its power to make rules and can set up an independent enforcement agency, which is the same agency, and can be the same people that interpret that rule. Right. So here you are, a businessman trying to do business, right? Imagine, if you will, the people making the rules, the cop that's arresting you, the prosecutor that's prosecuting you, and the judge who's going to say whether or not the whole process was fair are all the same entity. Yeah, you have reduced rights. It is an invitation to corruption. And that is what we've experienced increasingly in the last 100 years in my country.
Let me try to be a devil's advocate again. And I say, like, okay, I get it that maybe antitrust is not the best, and maybe historically the better people in industry have behaved way much better than what I thought they behaved, and actually they contributed a lot to human prosperity and to human well-being. But at the same time, I'm afraid that when they get a lot of money, they will be able to buy politicians. And when they buy politicians, they will co-opt all the political system, and they will make it in such a way that it will only benefit to them and not the whole people, or it will coerce rights of people that these industrialists don't want.
That money can only be a political threat if the government has the power to exclude competition or grant special favors. I mean, it would be no good, no matter how rich you were, no matter how much money you gave to a politician, if the government itself was forbidden. Just as that's why the example of church and state is a really good one. We need to have a principled, absolute distinction here. When the government cannot grant special economic favors, subsidies, regulations to certain firms over other firms, it does not matter how much money they would contribute. In fact, the contributing of the money is mostly designed to get coercive favors from the government to enhance their competitive position. The issue here is not how rich private people are getting, but the power that government could give them if they buy the politicians. Let's assume that we had a world in which Ayn Rand's separation of state and economics was built into the Constitution and treated just as seriously as the separation of church and state. You couldn't buy a politician to give you that favor. No amount of money you gave them could get you that favor, because government simply couldn't grant such favors. No, it's the power that government has that's the fundamental problem. We need to limit the power government has over the economy. That alone will eliminate the corruption. The corruption is inevitable. You're arguing a secondary point when you see that corruption. That corruption is just inherent when the government has that kind of power to give out favors. You take simple zoning laws. They didn't, land use laws within cities. We have in our country certain laws that local governments pass that say commercial activity over here, industrial activity over here, agricultural activity over here, residential activity over here, right? When it began in the 1920s, again, about 100 years ago. Take Texas, two comparable cities, Houston and Dallas. Dallas had zoning laws to begin with from the outset. Houston didn't. Only within the last couple of decades has Houston actually developed zoning laws. Where was greater use concentration? Houston. There were fewer such things were separated better in Houston, just as a matter of the automatic process. Whereas in Dallas, let's see, there's less flexibility. The neighborhoods can't change, so you're sort of stuck into certain zones, right? Urban decay happens, and still worse, corruption happens. If I want to change the zoning laws and build a park or build a farm or build a business over here, I have to change those zoning laws, I have to line the pockets of politicians, beg for favors, make political contributions, go to the right parties. That's what's deciding in Dallas who can open up a new commercial zone in an area that hadn't been previously zoned commercial. Whereas in Houston, no politician had the power. No politician could say where commerce or agriculture or residence could be. And so no one needed to bribe politicians. There was no incentive to contribute to campaigns. It's the power government has in the first place that is the source of the corruption.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting to bring another topic, which is how to judge these people. And at the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned Homestead, but it was the Homestead Act, right?
Right.
But in this topic, there's also another Homestead, if I understand correctly, is that there was basically an issue of between a union and Carnegie, yes. and there was in Homestead there was a big fight between them.
That's just the name of the place in that case.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Right.
And I don't know the exact details of the issue, and it has been brought up as a big concern that Carnegie wasn't up to the task, and he maybe wasn't good in his response, and maybe let's assume that he was. How should one judge people, these kind of industrialists, in this set of issues where maybe they weren't at the height of what they should have been?
Well, I would say that in principle, so long as the government doesn't have those powers to grant, and notice what's going on here. The labor, it may be that certain steel manufacturers like Charles Schwab worked with their labor better than, say, Andrew Carnegie did, right? But that will have a competitive effect if the market is free. Men like Charles Schwab will be preferred over men like Andrew Carnegie to the extent that there is some kind of uncompetitive mistreatment of labor. And that's the way to look at it, perhaps, right? Or the actual use of force. if a labor dispute actually results in two sides coming into armed conflict with each other, that is where the government does have a role to play in getting everyone to put their guns away, clubs away, right? That's the correct function to make sure that what's going on here is a matter of voluntary, non-coercive trade. So long as that's the case, I don't know what a labor abuse would look like, right? Because again, the industrialist is providing jobs that never existed there before he came along. And these are people voluntarily taking these jobs, seeing it in their self-interest. Now, you say, well, they're in that area, he's the only, well, they can move. America is known for mobility. You don't like what's going on in that town in Pennsylvania that Carnegie controls? Well, move to another town in Pennsylvania or move to New York. It's not like it's the other side of the world. So the way I'd look at it is this. The government can't step in to protect business or labor in a violent labor dispute. So long as the government can't grant favors to one side or another, and of course, in the last 100 years, they've been granting all kinds of special favors to labor unions, but in effect could only be called coercively monopolistic favors, right? This one union controls all the labor. Wow, if we were to think of that in terms of the private firms, we would say that's a monopoly. And do we see monopolistic abuses from government enforced, single power? Yeah, we do in labor unions. So it seems to me that whether it's favors for government or for the business from government or to labor from government, they're both in effect the same thing, the coercive interference with labor. And so long as the government, again, isn't taking sides in the armed disputes that might have occurred, and so long as it's all voluntary, then of course, it's hard for me to even understand it as a, quote, abuse of labor. Does that make sense?
It does. And there's another issue on how to think about these people, which I would like to ask you is how to think about people who were more mixed. And in the modern world, I think someone like Elon Musk, and I think in the like 100 years ago, I think it was Schwab, but I don't remember exactly the whole dealings with him. But how would you think about some people who were on some dealings more like the industrialists, and then the other there were more like the big four that you mentioned at the beginning?
Our mixed economy, and that's how Ayn Rand defines it, right? It's neither really capitalist nor really a command economy. It's a mixed economy, right? A mixed economy is a reflection of a confusion on the part of policymakers and the public. This mixture of this, we'll put it this way, this confusion of ideas exists in individuals just as it does, more broadly. And this includes business people themselves, doesn't it? No, in fact, almost all of these figures, relatively heroic, relatively villainous, are all in effect mixed bags working in a mixed economy, right? We have to look at what's essential, right? And so, for example, we were talking about the big four versus J.J. Hill. J.J. Hill actually did take some subsidies along the way. They weren't essential to his, and he could have succeeded without them. So he's essentially working on the free market, bringing new industries to the area, developing the area that hadn't been developed, bringing in new immigrants, right? But James J. Hill was wonderful. One of the great quotes. What did he say? He said, "Give me Swedes, whiskey, and chewing tobacco, and I could build a railroad through hell." Right? Now that kind of grit and productive activity makes him, in my mind, sort of a hero. You take Leland Stanford, who's mostly a politician, mostly making his money off the public, sucking on the public teat. That guy is mostly a villain, right? Now, did Leland Stanford found Stanford University? Golf clap, right? They're all, in effect, mixed bags, and some of them are really mixed, right? But you can, I think, make a distinction between essentially capitalistic and heroic and productive, doing it voluntarily, and essentially someone who is, in effect, doing it by government coercion. And I think today it's even worse. I mean, a lot of our best economic minds or people in computers have rotten politics. They do not understand politics, or even why, say, the electronics industry, being a relatively free market in the last 60, 70 years, has created this huge revolution. Well, of course, where there's relative economic freedom, that was the trick. But the very people who made fortunes and created new products and gave us the internet, right? The people who gave us Apple and Microsoft and Oracle and Hewlett Packard and all these things that make this world of computers possible, were doing it because it was a relatively free market. Their innovations were what gave them the profits, right? And they themselves don't understand. Many cases, they themselves do not understand that it was the free market that made it all possible.
Indeed. And I also want to, taking this judgment topic, I was wondering, why do you think that people jump so quickly to treat these people as evil, like the good industrialists as evil? And for instance, Rand talks about this in another of her essays, and she says, like, when you ask people about Vanderbilt, they say, "Oh, well, I remember that he did something really bad to people and left them in bankruptcy." And when you and they say, "Oh, yes, that guy was really evil," but when you see the story, and it was really the people who want to get Vanderbilt into bankruptcy, and he defended himself heroically and just put these guys under uh, uh, like
And Vanderbilt's
yeah,
case was an example of competitors who wanted to use the government to restrict, right? He
yeah.
was fighting that. So he was really a hero. And if those guys went bankrupt, well, I'm not going to shed a tear. The fact that someone goes bankrupt itself doesn't tell us who the good guy or bad guy was there. Nor does the mere fact that Vanderbilt became one of the richest men in New York answer the question either, does it? He got rich because he was creating first ferry services between New Jersey and New York, and then centralizing the New York railroad system to the great efficiency of the economy of New York. He was one of the main figures behind why New York City is what it is and became what it was. That's a hero.
So why do you think that people jump so hastily to say
And
these people are?
there's psychological and ethical reasons, aren't there? Christianity begins by saying money is evil, the pursuit of earthly wealth is bad. Medieval monks for century after century were taking vows of poverty as part of their Christian devotion, right? Jesus himself, look at the lilies of the field, look at the birds there. They don't toil, they don't reap, and yet God provides for them. Don't worry about, what you eat, what you wear. Money is the root of all kinds of evils, we're told in the Bible. It's as difficult for a rich man to get into heaven as it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Money is attacked in Christianity like all worldly activity, like sex is. So there's a basic, coming from our ancient religious ideas, there's this hostility to life on earth, to success on earth. Further, there's envy. Evil thing of envy. Let's say you're not a Christian. You can still be influenced by this insidious doctrine of altruism, right? You can be, or you can still have a medievalist mentality. And perhaps this is the most innocent way of looking at it. They don't see yet the distinction between a medieval robber baron and a productive capitalist like James J. Hill or Cornelius Vanderbilt. And when you learn that distinction, suddenly, okay, it's not wealth that's the problem, it's how they got the wealth. That's the important issue. And so I think there's, on the more innocent side, there's confusion and ignorance, people telling them bad history and stuff. But in other cases, there are psychological and philosophical reasons that go really deep. And animosity to life on earth is what's rooted in the Christian hostility towards money and profit. Charging interest on loans was illegal in Christian Europe, right? For 1,000 years. That's why all this resentment against Jews who could be bankers developed, these wealthy Jewish bankers. Well, if it hadn't been for the Christian prohibition on charging interest on loans, right? So all that resentment against Jews was the direct result of Christians needing banking and having a philosophy that said that usury was evil. So Christian hostility to life on earth in general, right? The altruistic psychological effect of envy, yeah? and in the more innocent cases, a less and less excusable, but still present ignorance about actual history.
Thank you,
Make
and,
sense?
and it makes a lot of sense. So I don't see I don't see any questions in the Zoom chat. So I was wondering to make a last question. So one of the issues here is to separate between the good and the evil. And I was wondering if you could talk about how good these industrialists were, how sui generis, I hope that's the way that you pronounce it, sui generis they are. I mean, literally, it's a new position, a new kind of way of working in relatively new in the history of the world. So I was wondering if you could make a comment on this.
Oh, wow. This is the moment to really back up and appreciate Ayn Rand's approach to political theory, right? Right? You know, contributing. The way capitalism works and why capitalism works on a social level is because it liberates the mind. It frees reason, our fundamental tool of knowledge, which is also our basic means of survival. Capitalism works by liberating reason, right? And what is reason but creative thought? I mean, human free will works because the mind opens up new options, new alternatives. My thinking allows me to do things in a creative way, right? By liberating reason, you create new markets, inventions, progress. People will experiment with things. People will do things differently. It is freedom that makes that possible. Freedom is what allows the individual mind to operate at full force, right? And if everyone's mind is operating at full force, there's nothing paradoxical with an advancing economy, is it? You're going to find new industries, people will invent televisions and computers and things that we never knew we needed. Yes, they'll be sui generis. They'll create things that no one had, products that no one had ever imagined they needed. Products that no one had ever even thought that they might have, oh, wow, this really improves my life. And suddenly it's there and no one had ever even conceived of it before. To get that stuff, you need to liberate the human mind. Freedom, capitalism works because it maximizes the use of reason in a society. Just as a censorship will destroy a culture, so economic regulation will destroy economic and technological progress, and for the same fundamental reason.
Thank you. There was a last question indeed. I was wondering, it's from Stephanie. She's wondering if there's such a thing as a conflation between political power and economic power when discussing these kind of issues.
Yeah, power is real different. Political power is violence, force, guns, jails, armies, police, real physical force. I say economic power, what am I saying? Boy, he's a creative businessman. Boy, he's efficient. Boy, he keeps cutting costs. Boy, he keeps coming up with creative products. His economic power, his wealth, what can his economic power, his wealth do? It can buy more, it can invest more, it can, okay, but can it point a gun? Can it coerce anyone? No, without resorting to either rank criminality or government favors and force, his money is only as powerful as he can voluntarily use it to trade with others, voluntarily, right? Economic power is like intelligence or strength. Political power is nothing more than violence, threats, and destruction. So the two could not be more diametrically opposed and opposite, and yet they are conflated completely. He's getting too much power. Well, what do you mean by power? You mean he's getting a lot of wealth? He can invest in things, he can buy a fancy house? Okay, that kind of power is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Where political power is usually very frequently abused because it's force. It's actual force and violence. It is the destruction of values, not the creation of values. It's all the difference in the world, economic and political power, between the power of creation and voluntary interaction and the power of destruction, threats, and violence. Literally, it comes down to just exactly that.
I think Stephanie might wants to make a clarification of the question. Maybe I didn't ask it as the way that she wanted, so I'm gonna unmute her.
Thank you. Yes, my question was, I understand the difference between them. My question is, why are they conflated, especially in our age? What's going on? I mean, I guess it's probably a psychology question. Hi, Bob.
I think Bob may have an answer.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, why are they?
What do you think, Bob? Did you? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay, Kenny?
I was waiting to get unmuted there.
Okay, I'm sorry.
If you think about it from the perspective of the one who conflates, what is it? Why are they not seeing the difference? And it's really because they're focusing on a rather narrow issue, and that is, I want to do something. This thing is not letting me do that, and whether it's force or because I can't afford it, they're in the same category. It's the focus on I can't get my wish that makes them conflate that.
Right. They confuse whim worship, right, with rational purpose, or
and why it's so prevalent now. What's the main difference in the intellectual capabilities of the culture today and in the past? And Ayn Rand answered that as the anti-conceptual.
And all the progressive education has destroyed more kids rather than help them grow their minds. It's worked to destroy them so they can't think, they can't process. They're just fed stuff and they take it in and they run with it.
Exactly.
They don't even know how to question.
Boy, you really are zeroing in on exactly what I was going to say. And the only addition I would make is this. It takes a conceptual mentality to understand the distinction between freedom and power in one sense. Power is a strength, an ability, right? Freedom is simply the absence of coercion, right? People will often confuse freedom with power. If do I have the power to go to the moon? Maybe not. I can't jump to the moon, right? I have to, right? Do I have the freedom to go to the moon? Well, is anyone interfering with me? The only question of freedom is am I being interfered with by someone else? Power is simply an ability. And this confusion between power and freedom is, people will often say, I don't have the power if I don't have the money to do it, for example. I don't have the power to do it if I don't, right? It's true you don't have the power if you don't have the physical strength or the money, but that's what it is. It's an ability, it's a capacity. Freedom is merely the absence of coercion. And this conflation of freedom and power is the result of an anti-conceptual mentality that can't really see the difference, right? So to understand the conceptual slices that Ayn Rand is making here requires an active conceptual mentality. And that lesson really hasn't sunk yet, right? The difference between freedom and power, right?
Right. And the ones who do understand it, they want to stoke up the envy and the resentment.
Right.
Right. So there are a few, the Ellsworth Tuohys of the world, who do understand.
I think so.
And they are looking to get more power, political power over everyone by getting people to run screaming and yelling into the streets, demanding irrational things.
Right. And that, of course, there are people who who do know better. That's all the more important why we need to promote Ayn Rand's ideas. The very distinctions here between economic and political power, between power and freedom, right? Those kind of.
True, we are more powerful now than any previous generation, where they had, they felt it was wrong, they felt things wasn't correct, but they didn't have philosophy all the way to the root that we have. So even though it seems like there's so few of us, but that Ayn Rand existed, that we have this amazing tool, right? And we have something strong to stand on that is really solid. Then, we're in a stronger position than any previous generation that faced the same issues but they were struggling. They were a bit blind, and it shows in the documents. They made errors, and now we have the
now X-ray vision to see what's really going on, right? It's this insidious altruism that stems from ancient mysticism that is still infecting the way we look at success on earth, money, things like that. It really comes down to mysticism, altruism as the insidious ideas that are blurring the conceptual distinctions that are important here. Indeed.
I think even people who they haven't got their minds developed to the best they could be, but they've got they're able to go about their business, to shop and budget and cook a meal. And, like most people are able to do these basic things. And it's really finding a way to reach them and say, look, you are rational. You're doing things. You're behaving like a good person. And there's this key that you're missing. You don't even realize there's a lock that's there to be unopened, but here's the key, and here's how you find it, here's how to use it, right? So
right. I mean, just think about it. The way so many parents get their kids to finish eating their vegetables or something, right? Is that there are starving children in India, there are starving children in China. So it's one of the classic cliches, right? In North America, why children should eat their vegetables, right? It's a totally altruistic collectivist justification, isn't it? It almost makes you feel guilty rather than encouraging you to eat the thing. Every morsel I eat,
pack it up and send it to them.
Starving child on the other side of the world. My God, what a perverse way of looking at it, right? And yet that perverse way
more leftover dinners in the mail.
But those kind of perverse moral ways of looking at it are sort of built into our psychology. Every morsel of food I eat is really coming at the expense of some starving child on the other side of the world? No, it is not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Oh. No, I was raising to answer. It's an interesting coincidence that I sent a letter to the editor off today about the difference between economic and political power. It's a very common issue. In fact, I think my paragraph said, that's an all too common error, and then I went into it.
It is. These are the important distinctions that are intentionally kept blurred by people who have a motive to do so, and keep the masses in ignorance. And the only solution is Ayn Rand, a philosopher who understood these distinctions like no one had in human history. Correct.
Thank you. So we don't have any more questions. I was wondering if you would like to make final statements, James?
Oh, wow.
Or if you want.
What Ayn Rand does in Atlas Shrugged is an astonishing thing. It is not that all the businessmen are good guys, right? At all. She shows James Taggart and Orrin Boyle and their cabal aiming for special government favors to maintain their economic position and get rid of the competition. And she shows, on the other hand, the struggle of truly rational, productive people trying to do it in a voluntary way, right? Yes, make money. Yes, get as rich as they can. Yes, do what they love to do. But they're not doing it through government force or favors. Ayn Rand was not a believer that just because you're a businessman, you're a hero. Some of those guys are bad guys, right? Some of those guys are in effect comparable to robber barons. On the other hand, and here's the positive and maybe the most important point, the American capitalistic business person who is doing it on the free market, who is doing it voluntarily, who is creating new products and creating new efficiencies, they are heroes. Far, far from merely being some efficient cog in the wheel, some, Adam Smith paradox of selfish people somehow paradoxically resulting in collective benefit through some invisible hand. No, Ayn Rand is saying there's no paradox here. These are heroic, rational, brave people with single-minded purpose, advancing humanity, contributing to all of our lives. They're superheroes. A free market business person is a hero, a moral hero. How about that for the first time in the history of economics, literature, and philosophy? And yet she's very careful to point out that this is not all businessmen. It really depends on how they make their money. So that would be my final statement here. Atlas Shrugged is the definitive statement on all of the distinctions we've been making here today.
Thank you very much for those powerful words. Now, in the name of Ayn Rand Center UK, I thank all the audience for everything, and I hope for them to meet us again next Wednesday with the discussion of philosophy. Who needs it? Thank you.